Okay, friends, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on voter IDs and how a student ID at our colleges or an employee ID at our colleges may be used as a voter ID. We're grateful to have Lindsay Wakely, did I pronounce that correctly? And Jessica Buie to join us here this afternoon from the North Carolina State Board of Elections. And we're expecting a great presentation from them. And so be prepared to ask all your great questions as we move forward. And presenters, I'll keep an eye on the chat for us. And as any questions come in, do you prefer to stop and answer questions as they arise, or would you prefer to wait till the end?
I think overall it may be helpful to wait until the end, but if there are some questions that come in as I walk through the presentation, Jessica may be able to answer a few that she is able to address, and if not, we'll be happy to go over everything at the end. I am going to try to keep the presentation short and sweet so we have as much time for questions as possible.
Wonderful. So without further ado, we'll turn the mic over to you, Lindsay.
All right. Well, thank you again. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's very exciting to see we've got such great turnout. And we are very grateful for this opportunity to be able to connect with you. I am going to attempt to share my screen and I will ask JW and Jessica to make sure that you are able to see what I am sharing. So hold on just a moment. All right. And can I confirm that everyone can see it? Okay, wonderful. Great. Well, thank you very much again. Our objective today is really to give you a brief overview of the student ID and employee ID approvals for the 2023 and 2024 elections. This is some information that we have worked with the community college system and with other partners throughout the state of North Carolina to make sure we are making available, but wanted to have an opportunity to give a brief overview again, specifically to this audience, and then of course to answer any questions you may have. We'll try to keep this fairly detailed, but at the same time, we're not going to be able to cover everything in a presentation today. So by all means, please send questions during this conversation, and you're welcome to email us with any questions you have afterwards. Again, my name is Lindsay Wakely. I am Deputy General Counsel for the State Board of Elections. Jessica Buie, who is with us as well, is our Learning and Operations Manager. If any of you have already reached out to the agency with any questions, Jessica may well have been the person you have spoken with thus far. So to start, beginning with the 2023 municipal elections, registered voters in North Carolina will be asked to present a photo identification to vote. While the municipal election days themselves take place in September, October, and November of 2023, just as a reminder for the September municipal elections, voting will actually begin in August. So it is just around the corner with the absentee ballots going out and voting starting in August of 2023. So we are on a tight timeline moving forward. And for those of you who are not familiar with sort of why we're in the state we're in today, voter ID previously had been enjoined by the courts in North Carolina, so we were not moving forward with implementation of voter ID. That changed with the Supreme Court ruling we received in April of this year, so we have moved quickly to do a variety of things for implementation, one of which being the application process for student IDs and employee IDs. So examples of acceptable IDs for the upcoming 2023 elections, and this is sort of a full list just for your general knowledge. Active North Carolina driver's license may be used as a voter ID, non-operators licenses issued by the North Carolina DMV, current passports or passport cards, voter photo IDs, which will be issued by the County Board of Elections, certain out-of-state drivers and non-operators licenses, military identification cards, veterans identification cards, tribal enrollment cards, and certain ID cards for public assistance that are issued by the U.S. government or a state government. And then, of course, what we will be focusing on today, student identification cards and employee identification cards that are issued by universities of North Carolina, the community college system, eligible private schools, as well as state and local government entities, including charter schools. And both the student ID and the employee ID IDs are a little different in the sense that there is an application process that goes with those. So the state board needs to actually receive certain information and make a determination before those particular IDs for those institutions can be used in the upcoming election. If you take nothing else away from this presentation today, one thing please to remember and keep in mind, the application process opened on June 1st of 2023, and the application deadline is June 28th of 2023. So just a few weeks away. By this application deadline, all materials need to have been received for review by the State Board of Elections. The State Board will make a determination by mid-July of 2023, so we have an opportunity to educate our poll workers and the voters on permissible forms of identification ahead of that October 2023 start of voting. So an important point in particular for this audience, when it comes to ID approvals, you have the opportunity both to seek approval of your student ID cards and any ID cards that you may issue to your employees. That's because our community colleges are also defined as a public employer. Therefore, you're able to submit for both. But it is important to keep in mind, if you do want to seek approval for both your student ID cards and your employee ID cards, that will require two separate applications. It cannot be handled on a single application together. There are some differences in terms of what is required for each application. So two separate applications will have to be submitted if you would like to seek approval both of your student ID card and any employee ID card you may have. A select group of community colleges will have received approval when we did go through this process a number of years ago in 2019. If you were previously approved by the State Board of Elections on or before March 15th of 2019, your ID cards contained an expiration date, and there have been no changes to the card since approval, there is a bit of a fast track under the law for the reconsideration of those previously approved cards. But again, this doesn't apply to all cards that were previously approved. This only applies if you meet all three of these requirements. If you do meet all three of these requirements, the approval form has a checkbox for basically no changes. And so that's a checkbox that's going to say statement of no changes. You may check that box, sign the form, and submit. You do not need to submit a new digital image. And we'll go into sort of the details of what's required with the application in the next slide. But I wanted to make sure for anyone who may have gone through this process once before, you are aware of the fact that this is an option that you may exercise if you choose. So in terms of new applications, there's really two components to a new application. The State Board of Elections has to obtain certain certifications about cards issued during the approval period in order to move forward with approval of a card. So there's really two documents that need to be submitted to the State Board of Elections for approval. The first is either the signed student identification approval form or signed employee identification approval form. Copies of those forms were provided to you when I think the initial correspondence regarding the ID application process was sent out. We've also made those available through our website, so those are certainly available on the State Board of Elections website as well. And of course, you're welcome to reach out to Jessica and I for copies of that also. And then also a digital image of both the front and the back of any identification cards that you are seeking approval of. So if there is no back to the card, that's okay, but we do need to see both the front and the back of the card if you have two sides to the card. Both the approval form and the digital image need to be emailed to the address you see on the screen, which is voterid@ncsbe.gov by that June 28th deadline, in order to be considered for approval by the State Board of Elections. So when we talk about the certifications that need to be made on the approval form, what you'll see is certifications, a number of different requirements that have to be met in order for the State Board to approve. We've had a lot of questions come in about what is the time period I am making these certifications for. So when we're talking about our applications, we're talking about applying for your card, for your institution cards to be considered during the approval period. That approval period begins July of 2023. So it begins when the state board issues its initial approval, and then it carries through the end of the approval period, which is December 31st of 2024. So as you're filling out this forms, it's important to keep in mind the fact that the certifications you are making are for this time period. So if a certification, if it's something you can't certify to as of a year ago, that's okay. You're looking at making these certifications for a card that is being issued, beginning July 2023 through that December 31st of 2024. Keep in mind with this December 31st of 2024 date here, what we are talking about is the approval of the card, both for the 2023 municipal election and then also for use in the primary and the general election. So this is an application process that if you go into the application now, that is going to be an application that covers your cards through not just the municipal election, but the next 2 elections as well. In completing a new request, it is important to be sure to check each box that applies on the application itself. We are looking for a separate certification for each box. So we'll need all of those completed in order to be able to accept your application and for the board to be able to move forward with an approval. If additional documentation is necessary with your application, please be sure to submit that documentation with your approval form and the digital image to voter ID at ncsbe.gov. If additional documentation is needed, that form will prompt you where those circumstances are required. And then who may sign the approval form? This is another very important component. For student IDs, the statute is specific that the approval form must be signed by the chancellor, the president, or the registrar of the college or university. And for employee ID forms, the application must be signed by either the head elected official or the lead human resources employee. In the case of our community colleges, we're probably talking about the lead human resources employee as the signatory on the approval forms. Again, I know there's a distinction here. If we are in a situation where we have got a school that's looking to go for both the student ID and the employee ID, there is a difference in the signatories, but unfortunately we are bound by the law on that, so we don't have the ability to have any flexibility in terms of who the lead human resources employee is. To a certain degree, we're gonna defer to the college itself to define who that person would be within your institution. All right, to jump into a couple of initial questions that we find we're getting quite a bit of as we've started off the application process here. We've gotten a number of questions about what limits may apply to the expiration date that needs to be listed on the card. There is no limit in the law on what the expiration date may be. So, for example, if the expiration date on your student identification card is 10 or 15 or 25 years in the future, that's okay. You can have a very generous expiration date on your ID card, and that would still be acceptable as part of the approval process. We've used as the example quite a bit, if you were to choose to put on an expiration date of, 2033 or the like, that would be acceptable. There is no limitation there. And at a minimum, we are looking for an expiration year. So, we're not necessarily needing a month, date, year. At a minimum, we would need a year. And so if something like an expiration date of 2025 was listed on a card, we would interpret that to mean the expiration is December 31st of 2025. So again, if you're dealing with space issues on the card or anything like that, keep that in mind. The priority is to make sure at a minimum we have a visual year listed on the card for the expiration date. We've also received a number of questions of whether an entity can meet the statutory requirement that an ID contain an expiration date by affixing a sticker with an expiration date to the card. The answer to that is yes. A sticker with a printed expiration date when added by the issuing authority will meet the requirement of the law. As part of the application, though, we would encourage the entity to provide additional documentation that describes the process to be used to apply the sticker to the expiration date on the cards you're issuing. So if you are issuing cards beginning in July 2023, sort of using your standard vendor, using your standard practices, but do need to add an expiration date to that card in order to meet the requirements of approval on the application form, then a printed sticker would be sufficient, but just include a document with your application that sort of explains to us how those stickers are going to be printed, how they're going to be added to the cards. What is that process going to look like? A simple summary would be fine, but having that additional information would be helpful in the case where you were using any type of sticker or additional thing that you are affixing to the front of or the back of the card to meet that requirement. We've also had a handful of institutions reach out asking about whether an electronically embedded expiration date in the card would be permissible. The answer to that is no. We do require a visible date on the card in order for the card to be considered for approval. So you know, what we're really looking for when that application is being completed is to have the signing official certify that the front or the back of any cards issued during the approval period will show an expiration date. So we will be looking for a visible expiration date. Again, similar to what we just talked about in the last question, if you have an electronically embedded expiration date, if you were to add a sticker or something like that to the front of the card that makes that electronic date now visible to a poll worker or to someone who may be viewing that card, that would be the preferred method. All right, I've taken about 20 minutes so far, so I do want to jump into questions, but just to make sure everybody's got this available, highlighting on the screen the key email address to send any questions you may have to that we aren't able to address today, or any ongoing questions that come up after today, is voterid@ncsbe.gov. And we are doing our best to respond to questions that come into that account as soon as we possibly can. So I do encourage you to reach out by that means if you've got any additional questions. So we thank you for the time you've given us to give a brief overview today, and I am happy to jump into any questions that you may have.
Lindsay, there is a question that I'm not sure the answer of, so I saved it for you. It says, can we have an issue date and then a procedure that the card expires X number of years from the issue date?
So I think we do need at least an expiration year listed on the card. I think it would be a challenge for us to have an issue date and sort of a more general description of a year. I think we're certainly, if there's a particular example of that you'd like to submit to us for review in advance of submitting your application, we're certainly happy to do that. But our standard at this point has been to require at least a year for the expiration. So we are looking for that minimal visual indicator on the card.
So the next question is if we can discuss the difference in application process for institutions that may allow students to upload their own photos to their student ID. So when I receive applications that indicate that, if you haven't included it, I would respond to you asking that you have a separate statement explaining that process and how that works at your institution, where you would be detailing how the student is allowed to upload that photo and any kind of other verification that you may do to indicate that that photo is of that student. Lindsay, feel free to add on to that. But from my perspective, as the initial intake of that application, that's what I would be looking for.
Yeah, and it is permissible to have a student selected photo used on your student ID or your employee ID. But what is clear is we do need some sort of explanation as part of the application packet that's just going to give an overview of what you do, in fact, to verify that that is a photo of the student you are issuing the ID to. So again, kind of like what I talked about before, we're looking for just sort of a brief summary. Just give us an overview of what it is that you do to verify that that is, in fact, a photo of the student you are issuing the ID to. Once we have that, that's an acceptable means for us to move forward.
The next question is, does the student's legal name have to be on the card, or could it be a preferred name?
Now, that is a question I may need to double check on. I believe under the law, it does need to be a legal name, but that is a question we'll go back and refer to. And what we'll do is, if there are any questions we can't answer today, we're going to take those notes and we'll make sure we get those distributed back to you. So you've got all the correct information coming from this as well. So I'm making a note of that one right now. We'll be sure to follow up.
The next question is, are there additional security requirements like physical security, limited ID checks, and training? I can kind of answer that while Lindsay's jotting down. Some of the questions on the form that you are attesting to, or that you do have some kind of security measures in place. mainly to restrict access to the equipment, and that there's some kind of penalty for a person who misuses the equipment. So those are detailed in the checklist attestation. So be sure that you're reading those carefully, because when you're checking them, you are saying, yes, this statement is true. Lindsay, feel free to add on to that.
And I think you may in part, Michael, be echoing the fact that there is a component within the law that says the state board has the ability to require that additional security measures be in place as part of the application approval process. We have not done that. So the certifications that you see on the approval form are the key certifications here. There's no additional security requirements that the state board has imposed on any equipment or any of the processes at this time.
Well, those are the only questions I see so far. I think we've answered most of them as we were going. I did add that the no fee ID that the DMV issues is also accepted. And that I listed the voter ID email. If you have questions about whether or not your entity is able to select statement of no changes, you can email us asking if you're eligible. I'll double check that for you and get back with you. I also just wanted to mention, because it's happened with a few submissions already, if the back of your photo ID card is blank, you'll need to do one of two things. You should either still scan a picture of the back so that we can see that it is blank, or in your submission email, you should indicate that the back of the card is blank. Otherwise, I'll respond saying, what's going on with the back of your card? And we'll have to extend that process a little bit longer. Can you show the student ID checklist so that our colleges can briefly review the requirements?
I do not have that right up right now. Jessica, do you have a copy at all that you could share from your desktop?
I do.
And while you do that, I've noticed two questions come in that I think it may be helpful to elaborate on a little bit more. Crystal, I've noticed you asked the question here about multiple types of ID cards, and asking if you can seek approval for some but not all. So the answer to that is yes. But when you are submitting an application, you are submitting sort of a per card application. So if you have multiple student ID cards or employee ID cards that you currently issue, it's perfectly fine to submit multiple applications to have approval of multiple cards. If there is a situation though where you're actively issuing some cards that comply with the statute that you are seeking approval of, while at the same time you're issuing other cards during the approval period that you are not accepting or you're not seeking approval of, that is something we're going to want to make sure, we at least have some situational awareness of as we move forward. So it's okay to keep your application single card specific. Just know we probably will request a copy of whatever ID cards in the future that you may be issuing that have not been sought for approval as well, just so we've got the ability from a training standpoint to kind of have an understanding of what has versus what hasn't been approved. If you are going to pursue something like that and have two types of cards that are issued during the approval process, one that meets the requirements and another that doesn't meet the requirements for voting, I would encourage you to do something with those cards to make it very distinguishable. So if you have a naming convention with one where you maybe include sort of voter ID as part of the name of the card, that would be helpful, I think, to make a distinguishing between what's a compliant card that's been issued versus what is a non-compliant card for voting purposes that has been issued. Crystal, I hope that clarifies that a little bit for you. I noticed that we also had a question here about we are not currently printing an expiration date on our student IDs, but believe we can with some minor updates. We know we cannot be ready for 2023, but would like to be approved for 2024. This is not going to be the only opportunity to seek approval before the 2024 elections. It's a very important point that I want to make clear. This will be the only opportunity to seek approval of your student or employee ID cards before the 2023 municipal elections. We haven't set an application time period yet, but we are anticipating taking an additional round of applications probably in November or December of 2023. So we have the opportunity to go through another approval process prior to the 2024 primary elections. And then if we've got the ability, we're going to do another approval prior to the 2024 general election. So there will be additional opportunities if you do not feel you can issue compliant cards during this upcoming approval period, which is right now going to be starting in July of 2023. We do anticipate an additional approval period. Anyone approved now will carry through, but additional opportunities for approval for a period likely probably beginning January 2024 will be available in the future. So I hope that's helpful. That's a very important point. And I know for some of you, there may be some sort of different interest too, depending on what your jurisdiction's elections may be coming up this year. We know we've got major elections in Charlotte and in the Mecklenburg area. We have other counties where we may not have as many municipal elections taking place in 2023. We certainly encourage everybody to take advantage of the opportunity to seek approval now, but we understand that there may be resource limitations and time limitations in bringing cards into compliance at this point in time. In terms, and sort of a follow-up component, I think that to that question, we are getting questions as well about cards that have already been issued. And we know that there are many circumstances in which you may be able to create a compliant card, but you haven't had compliant cards for the last year or two. So I want to point out a key distinction here between what is required for the approval process for the approval of cards under the statutes, and that is 166.17 and 166.18. And then what is actually required when a student or an employee goes to vote under 166.16. So a student or employee that presents a valid and unexpired or recently expired ID from an institution whose identifications cards have been approved through this process will be permitted to vote. So in other words, once approval occurs through this process, older IDs that are still in circulation are valid for voting as long as that ID is unexpired or recently expired. And recently expired would mean within the last year. So an ID that has no expiration date is not expired. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. I know that can be a little confusing, but there is a distinction here between the approval process and what is going to be permitted when a student or an employee actually presents to vote. But in order to be approved through this process we're talking about today, the institution's identification cards need to be that are issued beginning July of 2023 through December 31st of 2023. If you are seeking approval for those cards, an appropriate official must be able to make certain certification about the cards being in compliance with the statute. And again, that approval period is going to be from July 2023 to December 31st of 2024. And I know I've kind of talked about that one question. So Jessica, I don't know if you've had a chance to keep an eye on what else has been coming in while I've gone over those details.
Ms. Wakely, may I ask a follow-up?
Brian's got his hand up there. Go ahead, Brian.
Sure.
Thank you, Ms. Wakely. I just want to ask a follow-up to that. So in looking at the checklist that's on the screen here, item number 6 says the cards issued by the University College on or after January 1, 2021 contain a date or expiration. And that you were responding to my original question. And so if just assuming for 2024, that form was updated to say January 1, 2022, we would not be in compliance with item 6 here. And I didn't know what the balance between those items were. Thank you for letting me ask that.
Sure. So the way we have read the law is that cards issued for approval periods after January 1st, 2021 require an expiration date. So it's not that all cards issued after January 1st, 2021 have to have an expiration date. If that was the case, if you didn't have a card that had an expiration date, January 1st, 2021, you'd never be able to go through this approval process. And so we don't think that's what the General Assembly's intent was there. What we take that to mean is that when you submit for approval of a card at this point in time, the card you are submitting for approval, so the card you're making the certifications for and the card you're providing that you're providing a copy of the ID for will need to have an expiration date. It's not that you've had to have an expiration date on every card you've issued from January 1st, 2021 through today. It's that going forward, you've got to have an expiration date on that card in order for us to extend approval.
Thank you for that clarification.
So, Lindsay, I did answer a question in the chat, and I want to give the opportunity to chime in case I kind of got lost in the sauce a little bit there. There was a question about citizenship requirements and whether or not the college or the entity is saying that they confirm that that person is a citizen of the United States. Box 2 basically says that when you complete an identification card and you issue it to a student, you're attesting that you have methods for validating that person's identity to include citizenship, but we are not saying that issuing the card is only done for US citizens. That's not the same thing. That person would have to also be able to register to vote in order to vote and use the card. So the issuing of the card is a separate matter from whether or not that person is eligible to vote.
It's a may include but not limited to. So we don't have any specific requirement that you confirm citizenship status. And we don't have any recommendations in particular about how you would go about doing that, but that is a certification that has to be made in order for us to move forward with the application.
This is Crystal. I just want to offer an extra point of clarification as to why I
Sure.
was asking the questions about the preferred name and the cards. So we were previously approved. Unfortunately, we didn't get the date of expiration on the card. We have the issue date on the card, but not the date of expiration. But in this process, we have had a lot of students that don't want their legal name on their card for a various number of reasons. And so based on my understanding, we were not able to issue that card because of the legal name, and we're verifying like against social security number, birth date, citizenship status. So it would be nice if we could put preferred names on there so that we can be accepting of the student that wants their preferred name listed on the card and not possibly outing a student for something that they're not wanting to be outed.
Sure. Yeah, I understand that, Crystal, for sure. Thank you for that additional clarification. And we'll go back and research that question and follow up with you and with this entire group.
One question asked, will a college have to reapply for approval, or is the approval good until the card is updated? So I'll let Lindsay take that one. I think I know the answer, but I will throw it to the person who certainly knows the answer.
Yeah, so the approval is good through December 31st, 2024. If there are no changes, you may be a great candidate for that no change application that we talked about the next go around. But there will be a need to do another approval process in the future because this approval period is time limited. It's not an indefinite approval. It's only an approval through December 31st of 2024. But as I mentioned, if there are no changes to the card, you'll hopefully be in a good situation to be able to do a no change form in the future.
And I wanted to just announce one of the answers to one of the questions. It was, will the precincts know which cards are accepted? The answer is yes. They'll be provided a list that will be distributed statewide for all of the institutions that are approved.
I say so about the ticket.
And-
One way or the other, so. Well.
And we will be publicizing the list of approved schools pretty widely. So we will make sure that information and schools and employers will make sure that information is available on our website. We'll work with other outreach partners to make sure that information is distributed. So there will be lots of attempts to make sure that the community at large has an understanding about the use of those cards. And of course, there'll be a particular emphasis on making sure that our counties and our poll workers are aware of the cards that have been approved as well.
There's a question that asks, we also give out IDs to public patrons, and how will those cards be handled? That may be one we have to look into, right, Lindsay?
Yeah, that's one we may need to do some follow-up research on. I'd probably want to know a little bit more about what you mean by a public patron. I would assume that might mean someone who has some sort of access to the campus on some sort of limited basis, but that would be a great question. I would encourage you to reach out via email if you don't want to share today, to give us a little bit more information about who would qualify as a public patron, so we could look into that question further.
I see one is a example could be a user of the college library.
Okay.
And so it's what they're allowed to use to check out books at the community college library. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. We'll be happy to look into that.
And also looks like volunteers that tutor or senior citizens who can access some of the resources on campus.
Yeah, and I don't know if that would have one thing to just keep in mind. When you're making the certifications, it is for sort of all users of that card. So if you aren't necessarily going through the same steps when you are issuing cards to those public patrons, that would be something to take into consideration. I don't know if it's exactly the same type of card or if it's a slightly different type of card. We'll continue to work with you on that question, but that would be something to make sure, is it the same process for those cards, or is it a different process for those users as well?
I would also wonder if it's styled differently to denote that it's not a student or an employee. That might also matter as well. I see alumni as well as someone who could get a special card issued. So definitely some unique options here as well. Looks like the questions are slowing down a little bit, giving folks time to type.
Notice we have one question here I don't think we addressed. Would we need to include a document that specifies we have a procedure for issuing a sanction or misuse of an ID card equipment? No, there's not a requirement that you provide documentation for each certification you made. As long as you are in fact doing that, you can make the certification. Additional documentation is not required.
It's only if the student can provide their own photo.
Or if we're talking about another extenuating circumstance, like the example I used today, where, if you're doing something like fixing the sticker or something that may seem like it's a little bit of a deviation from what's described, anytime that's occurring, I would encourage you to include additional documentation or reach out with a question before you submit your application.
See, we had a poll pop up asking your likelihood. This is good for us to see too, I think.
Very, very excited to see that very likely is a leading category here in the poll. So, what I will say is we certainly encourage, and I realize again that this is a tight time frame for completing these applications. But we certainly, if you've got the ability, we very much encourage you, and we certainly appreciate the steps you're taking to support your students and your employees in voting in the upcoming election. So we appreciate the fact that so many of you are looking into and taking this option seriously for now, and certainly, of course, for the 2024 elections as well.
So the question is, we have online applications where the student attaches his or her own photo. Would those be acceptable? If you can still see my screen, option 1 in bold says if the photograph used is not produced by the university or college or its agents, you must certify in detail the process used by the university or college to ensure the photograph is that of the student to whom the identification card is issued, and must certify the process is designed to confirm the identity of the student to whom the identification card is issued. So yes, that would be acceptable, but you would have to provide that additional statement. So if that's something that you use, I would be looking for that in your submission to us.
Yeah, there's no issue with the fact that the photo is submitted online versus in person or anything like that. What we're looking for is sort of your explanation of, what what as part of that online submission process confirms the identity of the student.
Ms. Wakely, Dr. Kelly said this in the chat, and I just want to restate it because it was a question that was among our internal team in thinking about this. The college's role here is simply to say, we certify that this person stood before us and they are who they say they are. We do not have to give thought to citizenship status or other factors because the voting registration process will catch those matters. Is that a fair summary?
There should be some process of confirming the identity of the person you are issuing the card to. But I think to your point, it's not that you are proving their citizenship status per se, or their eligibility to vote per se. The registration is a separate issue. That's not something that the college needs to confirm, but you do, as you're completing the application, need to be able to confirm the fact that there is some confirmation of that the identity of the student you are issuing the card to. So an example of confirming the identity could be confirming their citizenship status. It could be confirming their social security number, birthday of the student, something that speaks to this is who this person is, but it doesn't need to rise to the level of confirming citizenship or eligibility to vote.
Thank you. And just for clarity, we have a pretty large international student population, J1 visas, F1 visas. And of course, those students are issued college ID cards because it is their library card, their access to many things. And we don't have to interfere with our process for serving those students, and all of our students or make an adjustment for this purpose. And I think that the two words in number 2, citizenship status, created additional questions for our internal team. And I just wanted to be sure we could go back and clarify those concerns. Thank you.
That's correct. There's nothing in this process that would in any way, shape, or form is intended to prohibit you from issuing an ID to somebody who's not a U.S. citizen.
Thank you.
Again, that's a part of the voting process that we'll handle separate and apart. What the IDs you are issuing will be used for is simply sort of the voter photo ID component. So it is being able to produce that card in addition to the other steps that you take when you show up to vote to confirm who you are who you say you are.
Thank you.
There's a question that asks, if we ask for students to have a government issued ID with a birth date in order to provide a student ID, would that satisfy that requirement?
So I guess the follow-up question I would have to that is, when you say a government issued ID, I assume you mean a state or U.S. government issued ID, so perhaps a North Carolina driver's license. I think if we're talking about a situation where it's a North Carolina driver's, exactly. All right, Dana, great. We're on the same page. Yes, if it's a North Carolina driver's license that is presented in order to obtain the student ID, I think that would be acceptable. Mr. Kelly, I see we've got a question from you as well.
Yeah, sure. So if I was at a college right now, I would be thinking, what's the liability for my college? So if there's fraud on the student side or on the employee side, and that picture is not accurate and it's not really who they are, what's the liability to the college? What's the risk?
There's no risk to the institution itself under the law and the way it is drafted today. If there were, what I will say is, the university, in order to continue acceptance of the university ID, if there is something like a change that occurs after you complete this certification, you will need to notify us of that change. That will be clear in the communication that is sent to any institutions that ID is approved. However, there's no real liability here for the university in a situation like you described, where there may be a student who provides false information about their identity to obtain an ID like this. We talked about a situation with with a patron, or if it was an employee situation where there was, fake information or false information provided, there is no liability for the institution under the law. What there could be, is a potential challenge to the use of that student's ID or that employee's ID when they present to vote, if there is some question about the legitimacy of the information that's been provided and that they are who they say they are, and the validity of that ID that is being presented. That's a separate process that would be handled by the voter in the context of presenting to vote, not anything that would involve the institution itself.
Trying to be good distance education facilitators by not being comfortable with silence and make sure we're not missing any questions. So the last opportunity for questions. Well, last opportunity in this environment. Of course, I'm sure our friends from the State Board of Elections will be happy to respond to any email questions that they use. So as we're coming to a close, just two things I'd like to highlight, and we may have another question pop up during this. But the first one is, if your college is seriously considering this, but you're not able to meet the June deadline this year, there will be other opportunities in the future. I feel like that's something we definitely want to highlight. Another thing that I would like to highlight is that but this process, the purpose of this process, as we reiterated a while ago, is that you're identifying that the student or the employee is who they say they are. You're not determining their voter eligibility. I think that's important to mention. And the last piece of system office guidance that we would like to provide is that this is truly up to your institution whether or not you want to participate. And we highly recommend that even though the registrar, for example, or the HR office can apply, can sign the document, we highly recommend that this be an executive senior leadership team decision along with your president to make sure that that senior team feels comfortable with you moving forward with this process. I see we have a couple of questions pop up while I was talking. Jessica, you want to take care of that?
So we had a couple of gratitude messages about us being here. We were happy to be here as well. One person did ask, how can we find out if we were previously approved? Please email us at voterid@ncsbe.gov and just ask, am I able to check statement of no changes because we were approved in the past? And I'll look into that for you, and I'll let you know whether or not you can select that or you should complete the entire form.
So as we're coming to a close, we will provide the recording for this presentation. That'll either come from JJ Evans or myself. Once we get that processed and posted on YouTube, we'll get that link sent to all the participants. And we'll pause one more time to see if there's any more questions. Any closing comments, guys? Lindsay, Jessica, any closing comments? Are you good?
Thank you all again for your time today, and we appreciate this opportunity to speak with you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoy your afternoon and have a great day.
Thank you.